Hello, welcome to the LaRouche PAC Weekly Report for February 1st, 2012. I'm John Hofel, and with me in the studio today are three members of our basement team, Ouyang Tang, Ben Deniston, Sky Shields, and Lyndon LaRouche. So good morning, Lynn.
Good morning. Today we're going to be treating actually two subjects which are interrelated. On the one side, we're now in a period which had become graver recently, which threatens a general breakdown and worse things possibly politically in the world. We're on the verge of a thermonuclear war, which is being initiated from the British monarchy, and which is a threat now to launch a thermonuclear confrontation with Asian nations, including Russia, which is Eurasian, China, and other countries. Russia and China are among two of the most important thermonuclear systems for warfare in the planet. The United States, with its submarine warfare for thermonuclear weapons, is probably the greatest power for killing on this planet right now. If the plan now is to have and has been since the time of the shutdown of Libya and the killing of Muammar Gaddafi, the intention has been to have the Israelis launch an aerial attack on Iran, and on the basis of engagements to set forth a conflict which will go very quickly to a thermonuclear conflict, probably launched by the United States under British direction against China and Russia. Right now, if you pay attention to the news, that the United States is now committed under Obama and under the British in particular to launch a thermonuclear war. It's their war. Obama's merely a figure who's being used in it, but it's a war. On the other side, we have another issue, which is a related one, that we are now faced with a danger of a general collapse of the world economy for other reasons. We're also faced with, and one of the causes of this crisis is the spread of a program also authored from London, from the British, which is the plan of kills, is to reduce the world's population, and it's explicitly stated publicly from the British monarchy, is to reduce the world's population rapidly from 7 billion people to 1 billion people. Of course, that would coincide, of course, with reducing the population to 1 billion people by means of thermonuclear war. These are the issues. We have recently the Democratic Party leadership has backed off from attacking Obama. Obama is the keystone for setting off this war. If Obama is not constrained, and there's no intention by the Democratic Party leadership to even attempt to constrain him now, which means we've got Mitt Romney, who's bad news in and of himself, and also then Obama, who's very bad news, a British puppet who will be dispensed with, but now is a great threat. So now these are the conditions under which we're talking about any issue, including scientific issues. These are the realities. If you do not put these realities up forward, you don't know what you're talking about. And most people out there, I think, don't know what they're talking about. In the case of the Democratic Party leadership, the problem, which I'm familiar with these people, and therefore I know what I'm talking about, is that they're scared. They're not particularly courageous people for a war kind of situation as this is. They don't want to face it. They will hope that somehow it can work out. And therefore the Democratic Party has given up the fight. Obama is the vehicle who's supposed to launch the United States into the war. And if there's no check on Obama, and there will be no check under Obama right now, that might change. I would hope it would change. But if Obama is not checked, you can kiss this nation and a few other nations essentially goodbye. Now, this involves also the question of population. And the chief subject that will be discussed here today will be factors in the population of species. Which species are going to survive and which not. And we have something to present today which is extremely important from a scientific standpoint, but with the aforesaid political implications and strategic implications. The matter that's going to be presented today is a demonstration of the proof that the idea of zero growth is also a threat to the existence of the human species. And we have the scientific evidence to prove it, contrary to a prevailing popular view among many people who tend to look from behind the people they admire. And so let's get started.
Right. I mean, we'll lay out a continuation of some of the discussion we had last week, discussing in particular using the heuristic model we put together for looking at developmental processes in general. We're going to take a look at why the entire program that's being proposed right now by the environmentalists is insane and destructive and will lead to the destruction of the human species, but also why underneath the specific policies that they're proposing is something that's identical to everything that's being proposed by the so-called right wing, the monetarist program, et cetera. Everything you're getting from, for instance, a Newt Gingrich, or everything you're getting from any of these other Republican candidates. That there's an absolute identity here between what's known as monetarism, free trade economic policy, deregulation, and the policies that are known sort of collectively as environmentalist policy, green policy, zero growth policy, lack of development. And in fact, that the primitive character here is the fact that these policies stems from the fact that these policies are explicitly not human. That in fact, these are the kind of policies that you would implement if you were a very specific species of animals. We'll see that the biosphere as a whole does not obey what they're describing. At never any point in time has the biosphere as a whole obeyed the policy being proposed by the environmentalists today. But however, individual species do have the character they're proposing for mankind, which is the idea of that, well, we will have no growth, no development. In fact, people will argue that, well, you can't really define what development is. Well, what do you really mean by progress? Can you really tell us what progress is? Can you define that? And what we'll go through today is that, well, yes, in fact, there are some very clear, very strict metrics. There's a very clear, very strict metric of progress that can be used, can be applied. And in fact, we find this is something that's expressed not just in human development, but in the development of the universe as a whole. And in looking at the process, looking at the principles that guide that development of the universe as a whole, it's going to get us to something that lies behind the shadows, behind the effects of certain types of what you would call anti-entropic development, is something that's actually more substantial. And it will be in looking at that we'll be able to define more clearly what we should call a principle of creativity and a principle of mind. We'll make the point here that mind is not something that appears once human beings appear on the scene. That mind is something that's implicit in the universe, and human beings are the unique, singular expression of that. The one time when you get that process that governs the universe as a whole reflected in an individualized form is in the appearance of human beings on the planet. And we'll discuss that rigorously. And with that sort of isomorphism in mind between the creative human individual and the universe as a whole, the creative principle of the universe as a whole, that isomorphism, with that in mind, we'll be able to look at these processes of universal development and draw much broader conclusions from them than you would be able to take from these specific isolated cases. The most significant conclusion I think we're going to get from the discussion today and the work that we'll go through today will be that the failure to abide, to recognize these processes, the failure to become sort of a conscious manifestation of this process of creative development will lead to the destruction of any society that implements that opposite policy. Any society that fails to move in this direction, in an actual progressive direction, will be destroyed simply by its attempt to prevent this forward motion. And so I'd like to take a look at a couple of, we're going to take a look now, walk more slowly through this model that we put together in earlier discussions here. We'll be able to model what we'll call the development of a closed system. And by closed system, we mean any system which is again, the model of what you get proposed by the environmentalists and also by your modern day monetarists, which is that you're going to find some, and it's one of the things that ever since the 27 Solvay conference and the takeover of quantum mechanics as a policy and the sort of the reign of reductionism, this has sort of been the view that the universe as a whole is and should be governed by a set of fixed laws. You have a set of fixed laws that function as your axioms for a given state. Those fixed laws, everything else that exists in your system at that time, is something that can be derived deductively from those fixed laws. So your system forms a closed axiomatic system. Now we're going to look at the behavior of any closed axiomatic system. What we'll use as our case study here, the first one we'll use is the system that precedes what's known as the PT extinction, the Permian-Triassic extinction, the late Permian extinction. This system is a very specific system of life on Earth, the biosphere. This has it will have certain very characteristic types of animal life, plant life, etc. that characterize it. We're going to take a look at that, and what we'll see in looking at it is that there's a very specific idea that governs the entirety of that system. And I don't use the word idea loosely here. I think what we'll, in the course of looking at this, we'll be able to define much more closely what do you mean by idea ontologically, not simply as people have sort of a loose sense of what this means by their own experience, what they think they've experienced as ideas themselves. But we're going to discuss from the standpoint of the actual physical universe, what does it mean to say that an idea exists? And we're going to compare that to the subsequent system here, where that system leading up into the Permian-Triassic is known as the Paleozoic, or the old animal life. The period post this Permian-Triassic, the PT extinction, known as the Mesozoic, the middle animal life. Now, there's a point at which that middle system becomes predominant over the pre-existing older system, the Paleozoic system. Now, that point is marked by a collapse point, an extinction point. And we're going to get to why that is not, the character of that is not something accidental. And I'll take a quick parenthetical to describe. This is something that is a source of much debate right now. There's a lot of work being done to try to explain kinetically why you would get these events known as extinction events in the history of the biosphere. These are very difficult to explain, and it's impossible to explain in kinetic terms. It's useful to see the attempts to try and describe why the PT extinction took place. To give you an idea of why this is difficult, this is a point in time, a point in history, where probably around somewhere between 80 to 90% of all species on the planet vanished. Now that's rather significant. If you, as looking through the fossil record, you see an incredible diversity. You do see a constant rate of background extinctions all the time. You see a constant turnover of disappearance of species, appearance of new species. That always happens. And in fact, it's important to take note of because with all the panic nowadays about trying to preserve endangered species, the biosphere has a notorious track record of not preserving endangered species. It doesn't really care very much. In fact, more than 99% of all species that have ever lived on the planet, have ever existed, have been wiped out by the biosphere. Now, so this is to give an idea of sort of who's the worst criminal. Of the WWF go and try and take on nature directly. But aside from that background extinction rate, which is, again, is significant, you get these singular events where you see the rapid collapse in biodiversity, the rapid disappearance of species, collapsing down to a very few, expanding out again. But what expands out after that collapse point is not the same system that was developing prior. What expands outward is a new system of which we will have seen the sort of the pre-existing elements in the system prior. And we've marked that off here on our image here by showing that you have an inception point for your secondary system, which exists within the primary one. But that second system we find developing within your initial system up until the point where it becomes the dominant factor, and the other system vanishes, dies out. The prior one dies out. Now, this is not an arbitrary. This is not an arbitrary event. This is something. The difference between these two systems is actually very strictly quantifiable. And in the difference between these, we'll be able to very clearly define a concept of progress. In fact, what we'll see is that the principle of progress is the driving principle behind this process. And the governing factor, the factor that governs what vanishes at this extinction point, and any extinction point, is that what is at that point in time violates this principle of progress. Mm-hmm. And we'll see, and because that's the governing principle, we're going to see why there's such difficulty in explaining how that could happen. If you try to, again, for the PT extinction, there's all kinds of attempts to try to explain it. Can you account for it by asteroid collision? Can you account for it by volcanism? And in fact, we'll see that there is a relation between volcanism and some of these processes, but none of them work kinetically to eliminate all life on the planet. It takes immense effort for these guys to even come up with a domino scenario that would do that. To have the volcano erupt, produce the right kind of environmental changes that would kill off the right things. They always have to add extra things on top, adding asteroid collisions in order to try and finish things off. No combination of what you've ever been told about an extinction event is enough to account for either A, the degree of destruction that you see, but certainly not B, the degree of anti-entropic development that you see through that event. Obviously, no volcano or asteroid is going to be able to account for the diversification that you see afterwards, for the actual growth, the anti-entropic growth. That same character is true of the extinction event which occurs much later, the KT extinction, which separates the Mesozoic from the Cenozoic. So the middle animal life from the new modern animal life. Now that break is that's the extinction event most people are more familiar with popularly. This is the extinction event that separates the so-called age of the dinosaurs from the age of the mammals, the whole system that comes later on. But we'll see that it's not simply the dinosaurs that vanish. Again, it's an entire system. The entire system that the dinosaurs were a part of is going to be governed by a single idea. And again, we'll be able to clearly define that idea. And we'll clearly be able to show when that idea vanished and when all of the elements that were all the specifics that were connected to that idea, all the physical elements predicated on that idea, that they vanish at the point that the idea vanishes. And again, a system which was pre-existing in sort of germ form within that Mesozoic system, which becomes the Cenozoic system. That includes the mammals, but also birds, fruiting and flowering plants, grasses. There's a whole complex system there, which is already there in seed form. The entirety of the system is in seed form as one thing, as a single idea, during the Mesozoic, before the KT extinction. But after the KT extinction, after this point here, this collapse point, where you see the collision of the two systems, that later system, that Cenozoic system, takes off and again becomes the dominant factor. Now again, we're going to make very clear that this is not, there is a very clear metric, or in fact, there are a set of metrics we'll be able to see that define that growth through that collapse point. That it is possible to clearly define what you mean by progress, what you mean by development. The set of metrics themselves are going to be curiously sort of interchangeable, that you won't find any one that you're going to be able to just rest on. There won't be any one of these metrics. We'll look at a few values that are going to definitely clearly define progress, but you're going to see that they all seem to be sort of a shadow of something else. As you look at there'll be certain changes where some metrics will be seen to change, increase, other ones won't. And then other places where a different set, but between them all, they form one single set. But again, no one of these is going to be capable of defining what you mean by progress. There's going to be something else that's underneath it that's actually defining the process. That invisible thing that you see that's governing it, that will be hinted at, is going to be the most important part of investigating this process, and it'll be the thing that we'll be able to carry over into policymaking in general, into the discussion of policy with human society, human economy. So we'll take a couple of things. I'll give you just sort of one example here of what we mean by just the system in germ form across the KT boundary, across this extinction boundary here. That at this point, after this boundary is when you see the explosion, the real diversification, and then the rise to prominence of mammals, of birds, of fruits. Mammals do a very funny thing where you suddenly see they increase in size rapidly from these little mice-sized creatures that they were. At the time of within the Mesozoic, the system where the dinosaurs were included, all these elements, the birds, the mammals, etc., were so tiny as to be insignificant to the overall functioning of the system there. You get very small rodent-sized mammals, etc. Post-KT, you see them rapidly increase, actually going through a period of gigantism and then before finally shrinking down to the size that we know now. But even prior, if you take a look at post-KT, there's a system that actually ends up requiring birds as a crucial part of the development. Birds play a role. The whole system there with fruits, the spread of material for once you develop fruiting plants and seeds, birds obviously begin to play a big role in transporting seeds from place to place and maintaining the way the overall system functions. They increase, what we'll discuss later, a process known as biogenic migration, concept developed by the Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky. They're absolutely essential post this KT boundary, but not necessary prior to it. They don't play a huge functional role. Nonetheless, in that period before the KT boundary, you see a whole process of research and development. I think you can safely refer to as research and development, the actual hypothesizing that's moving towards the development of that later idea. So here we have the actual KT boundary. And after the KT boundary, if you can see here from just where these lines break off, the only one of these lines that continues past the KT boundary is the one that we know as birds, aves. But what you're looking at here prior to the KT boundary are all the places where you see the appearance of feathers and or feathers associated with flight prior to the KT. And the lines here, what's important in having the trees set up here, these are the kinds of things, these are plausible relations, evolutionary relations based on types of similarities here. And these are only plausible, none of these are known. But if you're trying to describe, well, what are the plausible relationships, you start to realize that you've got whole sets of, and again, these are the only ones that have developed feathers. So you get creatures that are otherwise totally unrelated developing feathers prior to the necessity for feathers in the system. In fact, you get creatures who are totally incapable of flight, large creatures like the velociraptor, developing feathers, not used for what feathers are ultimately developed for. But so you can see these sort of echoes of a future system. Two things are significant about this. One is that these are echoes defined by a future state. That it's actually a future state of the whole system which does not yet exist, which hasn't yet come to prominence. It's being tried out in this earlier period. This is going to take us to something we'll discuss through the course of our discussion here, to a real texture of what do you mean by physical time. And we're going to see echoes of it in this sort of causality, where the causality in this system is not what Laplace defined. It's not like dominoes. It's not that the cause for each event is the event which immediately preceded it. In fact, if you try to look at the events immediately preceding this research and development, you find no cause. Even in the event, even in the moment itself, there's no cause for it. Well, we'll get to that. The very idea of a Laplacian moment, where the idea that some slice of time, you can take some slice of time and have it be completely determined, is not true. That exists nowhere in the actual physical universe. That's a mathematical fiction. In fact, the actual the state, the reason for the state at any given moment, we'll find is only going to be found in a peculiar way, is going to depend in some way on the state on a much later state which is to follow. Now, at the same time, it is true that that later state which is to follow is only permitted, facilitated by the state which comes prior. So it gets us into a paradox in any attempt to try and represent time simply linearly. There must be some sort of there's a kind of a texture there that's required. And as we'll discuss later on, it's exactly that sort of a texture is the only kind of a physical universe that will permit human free will, but more specifically, human creative thought. That the real paradoxical question of, well, what kind of a physical universe, what universe will permit human free will to exist as a dominant feature, as a governing feature, is going to require a complete overhaul of what we've defined as time and space. And we'll have some first stabs at it in the course of this discussion here, because we'll see it's essential to really understand this process of development here. So you see this development, this beginning period you can treat as the apex of that cone, of that later system. The break here at the KT boundary, where you see the only one of these trends continue. Even though the research and development was done in all of these unrelated areas for feathers, one continues and then diversifies wildly into all the types of birds that we see today. That development corresponds to what we saw here with the appearance during the Mesozoic of the system that becomes the Cenozoic system. And then again, at that KT boundary becomes a dominant system as it expands. Now that's going to give us again, the ontology of physical time, which is very different. This is something that Vladimir Vernadsky worked on in some detail, the point that this is not, the time of mathematics and physics is not the time of the actual physical universe. That this is a severe abstraction. And this was known, it was known to many people that most people who think seriously about it realize that there's no mathematical representation of time that even corresponds to your most basic experience of time. The most basic experience that you personally have is that there's a distinction between what you know as the future and the past. There's no way to signify that mathematically. Even that simple fact about it is not simply signifiable by that distinction. But then there are more important qualitative characters of our experience of time, which are going to be contained in human creative mentation, which we'll discuss a little later. But those will be important because those are the ones that are going to be necessary to be understood for policy making. Questions of really defining, how do you know right now what policy direction the human species must take in order to ensure the sustainable survival of the human species? Now this is serious. I'll just take a quick diversion on that before coming back to some of these. That we want to have in mind some of the most interesting paradoxes, I think, of human development. One that we've brought up before, but is the paradox of real human education, which is a seriously paradoxical when you think about it. If you recognize that the human species thus far and into the future depends on the development and introduction of concepts that did not exist prior, actual creativity, the actual introduction of something which did not exist prior, and you say that our continued existence as a species depends on that. So you depend on us being able to introduce an idea which was not contained deductively in anything prior. Then what are you saying, what are you claiming that you're doing when you're talking about educating youth, educating a new generation? There's a lot of chutzpah involved in saying that you can successfully teach somebody to do something that you do not yet know how to do. There's a lot of chutzpah in saying that you're actually capable of having a new generation, that you can consciously take responsibility for a new generation and ensure that that next generation will be able to introduce something that does not yet exist, that you're not giving them deductively. This is not this is not animal training. There's something else being done here, which depends on this character of this process. And again, it will have this sort of quality where it's not the moment, there is no Laplacian moment which is capable of defining everything that comes after. Instead, there's something subsuming that has a very different character. So we'll come back to that, but first I'd like to go through one specific arc that'll contextualize for us, so contextualize what we mean by policy making. So we can take a look at what we've done with the policy currently proposed by our political movement as the necessary next step for the human species, which is NWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance, and how that kind of, just a quick case study to see, well, how our overall arc of development here relates to that as a policy to be implemented. And I think, oh yeah, you can take that.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think take it back to where you had the beginning of the Paleozoic there, because I think that's sort of the context for conceptualizing the process of not just growth, not just the sort of the lily pond growth in a linear way, but the actual development and transformation of the environment to the point that what you call the environment becomes indistinguishable from the process of development. Mm-hmm. So you can see that if you go back, you take the first major expansion of the biosphere from the oceans onto land. Take yourself back to a point, roughly 400 million years ago, 450 million years ago. If you were hovering above the planet and you looked down, you would see ocean, you'd see continents. What you wouldn't, you would see mountains, but what you wouldn't see is green. They'd be barren continents. If you zoom down, if you got a little bit closer, you'd find, you've got these vast kind of rocky plains and mountains and so forth. There might be little mats of algae. There might be a couple of little lichens stuck to the rocks, but there wouldn't be much else. It would be really a hostile environment, especially from the standpoint of anybody in the ocean. I mean, the creatures in the ocean had it good, right? All the nutrients are just floating around. They're sort of, you've got currents that are bringing nutrients to you. You're protected from the harshest forms of solar and cosmic radiation. You've got it made. Anybody from the standpoint of, anybody looking at life out on land would say, no, that's too hostile. We don't need to go there. There's nothing there for us, right? If you think about the actual process that had been developing through the Cambrian explosion, through that point about 540 million years ago where you had this rapid expansion in the oceans, I mean, part of what preceded that was a major pollution of the environment, right? The creation of a free oxygen atmosphere. And that completely violated the entire structure of the planet at the time. It forced it into a new phase. And part of what it did in creating the ozone layer, for example, the emission of free oxygen, the ozone layer, is it began to open up the possibility that the land surface, which up till now had been a total barren wasteland, all of that solar radiation just bouncing right off, almost nothing capable of living there, all of a sudden became the frontier for the development of the biosphere. Now what's interesting is that if you take a look at the process of movement from the oceans onto land, you get a sense of it's not the image that's often used is you've referred to it as the mold hypothesis, is that you sprinkle a little bit of mold and it's the equivalent of leaving your dirty socks out, and eventually some kind of fuzz will eventually grow over the surface of it, and then you have to toss it out. The colonization of land was much different. This was actually another serious violation of the existing environment of the time. Starting with the first modest land plants that come out, begin to kind of colonize the coastal areas where you still had a relatively moist environment. The first major innovation was to begin to create the vascular system. So going from the very low-lying moss-type plants, which were easily dried out, easily desiccated, they had really no internal plumbing, so to speak. They relied on the ambient moisture of the environment. They're obviously very limited in range. Once you began to create the vascular systems that made it capable of actually channeling water up through the body of the plant and transpiring that out into the atmosphere, what you began to see is a sort of a slow, and this is about 420 million years ago, a slow raising of what's called the boundary layer, which is the interface of the ground with the atmosphere. And there's a very specific change that occurs as you begin to raise this boundary layer. You actually change the characteristic of the airflow inside of this boundary layer. So if you imagine, maybe 400 million years ago, you've got the beginnings of maybe ankle-high plant life beginning to sprout up. Now, it wouldn't be completely obvious at the time, but this is a crucial sort of premonition of the type of process that would be necessary for the development of the biosphere on land, because you began to have the beginnings of an actual hydrological cycle. As this boundary layer gets raised, as you change the characteristics of the airflow, you moisten the airflow within the boundary layer, it expands the capability for plant life to expand itself. Now, part of what was happening at that time was a growth in a new type of relationship among living species. Again, you have to consider the land surface at that time was the most hostile environment you could imagine. You had constant drying winds, right? You had constant bombardment of UV radiation. You had to actually take everything that was given to you in the oceans and essentially package that into the equivalent of a spacesuit to be able to survive on the land. And this involved a number of specific innovations, specific technological breakthroughs. One of the first would have been the development of a waxy cuticle, a waxy sort of covering to preserve the water content inside of your plants. The other would be the ability to support yourself in a gravity environment. You don't really have that problem in the oceans. You've got buoyancy. All of a sudden, having to support yourself requires the creation of new materials. New materials that, as they allow you to expand higher, also force the development of root systems to be able to draw water from deeper, to be able to stabilize the plants. So at the same time that you begin to have a steady rise, you also have a corresponding movement down. Now this is key. Again, we say, what right did plant life have to alter the environment? And I think if you ask the rocks, they would say, look, life before plant life was completely different. As the roots began to creep in to the rocks, what you have is a cycling. The roots are actually taking the products of photosynthesis and channeling that down into the ground. What that does is it begins to break up the rock surface. You're not only breaking it up, but you're altering the chemical composition. You're altering the geochemistry. You're beginning to create new types of minerals. The evolution of the mineral diversity of the Earth really takes off corresponding to the radiation of life on land. We'll get to that in a second. But as this process develops, you begin to have again, a total transformation in the environment of the planet. Now soils begin you begin to create soil which had never existed before. The soil itself is a complex mixture of new minerals, new microbial communities, and this, combined with the interaction with the atmosphere, begins to create an accelerating flow of material between the atmosphere, the soils, and into the oceans, all mediated by the plant life that's growing, developing, and taking into itself creating inside of itself the equivalent of an ocean on land. Now, there's a key difference is that the cycling of nutrients in the ocean, again, is a sort of it's a whimsical process. It kind of depends on the movement of current and the winds and so forth to bring up nutrients from below. As you begin to create the development of a real biosphere on land, you have an active flow which is controlled by the machinery, by the plumbing so-called, of this system. The system involves an interconnection of plant life, of fungus, symbiotic fungus, to connect the root systems of these plants. You actually have to create a whole interconnected, nested network of living organisms that are capable of drawing into this system as a whole the required flow of nutrients that pass from the deep, from the soil through the system on land, up into the atmosphere, and then back down into the soil. A good image for this is to take the idea of the water cycle, the rain cycle. If you imagine, it's usually discussed as just a sort of a, evaporation and then precipitation, evaporation, precipitation, but it actually involves a much more active process. Like I said, taking in with the creation of the soil, you create a new capability to actually maintain the moisture of the soil, to maintain the water retention capability of the land. That now becomes a reservoir, which is drawn up through the root systems, is transpired into the atmosphere, and is recycled on land, which allows the actual growth, the spread of plant life further inland. So if you imagine now, you go back into your spaceship, you're looking down, and if you had a time-lapse view of this, you would begin to see thin layers of green at the margins of the continents beginning to move steadily inwards. Now, that in itself contains a whole set of what you referred to as, metrics for actual anti-entropic development. Number one, this becomes a necessary process for the flow of material through the system as a whole. It is controlling, for example, the flow of material into the oceans. Key elements like phosphorus or carbohydrates are now being modulated by the retention and the activity of plants. But secondly, this colonization inward into the land also involves a corresponding colonization upward into the atmosphere. Not only is the boundary layer being raised, but the composition of the atmosphere in terms of aerosols, in terms of microbial, in terms of microbes, and in terms of water vapor, is now creating a system where you're capable of you're creating new cycles which are growing, developing on the land, and feeding the density of this process itself. One example to consider is that one of the major limiting nutrients for plant life is nitrogen. Now, the way that the biosphere creates nitrogen, one of the major ways the biosphere creates nitrogen is through lightning. Now, as the density of plant life, especially as you begin to get the trees as they appear in the Devonian period, about 350 million years ago, this now with larger trunk systems, broader leaves, deeper root systems, accelerating the weathering of the rock, increasing the uptake of nutrients and water from the soil, increasing the evapotranspiration into the atmosphere. This begins to create the capability to have rapid movements of moisture into the atmosphere and the development of storm systems. If you look at a satellite map of the planet, the places of the densest lightning formation are the places where you have the densest foliage, particularly in the equatorial regions where you have rapid changes of ground temperature. So this now sets up a new structure in the atmosphere, a structure that's mediated through cloud systems, thunder systems, that now, through the creation of lightning, produce a key ingredient necessary for the plant life which is producing the flows of water that create that lightning, that contribute to that. Moreover, that the lightning itself is creating certain, is sending out in its, when as the thunderstorms develop, it's actually a mechanism for creating electromagnetic radiation, which is recent experiments in recent decades have shown is actually crucial is crucial for the regulation of plant life, animal life, and the biosphere as a whole. So what you're getting is, in this process, is not only a rapid expansion of biomass, in fact, much more biomass on a smaller amount of surface area than you even get in the oceans. So it's an incredibly fertile process that explodes. But you're building into the Earth new types of structures. You're essentially taking solar radiation and building that across the surface of the Earth, across the surface of the planet, into the atmosphere and into the soils, into the ground. An entirely new array of processes and a new array of elements, a new array of minerals, compounds.
I mean, it seems this makes because that, along with the no empty time point that we had on Laplace, really making a solid point for the idea of the non-existence of empty space.
Right.
Because you're showing us you've got the entire structuring of the oceans, the surface of the Earth, but then there's a structuring of the atmosphere, both gaseous, the way you're in composition, but then you're describing the electromagnetic structuring of that entire space. But also, if you include the fact that those Schumann resonances leak outward outside of our atmosphere, you're talking about life structuring all of that so-called empty space that's outside of the planet. And that's a very different mental image than most people have. It's definitely completely opposed to what you get from the environmentalists. The idea of this sort of fixed, stable environment that's just there and life lives inside of it.
The space-time myth.
Yeah, exactly. It polemicizes exactly against the idea that you've got some absolute thing called space and time that exists there. That's a fraud. This is the reality of it.
Right. And in this, you begin to develop a new metric for the energy flux density of the system as a whole. What you've got in increasing the interconnectivity of these various biogeochemical processes. Out of that, again, you're creating new types of materials, but you're also building into the system new potentials. I mean, the potential for speciation, for example, vastly increases as you bring into symbiotic relationships, as you bring into the sort of necessary interdependence of supposedly separate species into association. The ability to have rapid speciation all of a sudden increases. And that's going to be important as the energy of the system, the so-called baseline that we've shown with the succession of cones and the rising baseline requirements. Well, here you see, in a very vivid way, the way that baseline increases as life colonizes the land. That baseline is maintained through specific technological innovations. Again, the creation of wood, stronger materials for maintaining the plants, the development of roots, the development of leaves. These types of things, the development of the form of the tree, which, if you think about the morphology of a tree, is actually, it can be thought of as the way in which sunlight would sculpt an organism on Earth to maximize its impact. I mean, the formation of the branches, the leaves, is optimized for the maximum amount of solar radiation, to absorb the greatest amount of solar radiation, and to increase the surface area of the planet through the development of these leaves. In a sense, you're actually expanding the envelope of the surface of the Earth. You're expanding the envelope of biomass to increase its interface with the environment as a whole, in the same way that the creation of the soils, breaking it up into smaller particles, increases the interface of the atmosphere with the lithosphere, with the rock, mediated by this expanding range of actual living matter. So in the mind's eye, now you've got, again, a spread over the surface, a spread up, a spread down, and the baseline that's implied in that is, if you had to describe it, you'd say, well, now if I looked at that, now if I had to describe what constitutes the environment of the biosphere, what constitutes the environment of the planet, The environment of the planet itself is the creation of the process of this biospheric development over the course of about 100, 200 million years, bringing it to the point of the PT extinction. At that point, you had built into the system new types of potentials, and you can break it down in terms of new types of chemical potential, new types of biogeochemical flows, new types of actual movement and flows of material, all of which are kind of refractions of the process as a whole. And then you'll see the potentials, the full realization of the potentials in the way that that system is transformed in successive states.
But that's important. I mean, making that point that you've got that there's a single, because it also defines a whole class of animal life that are capable of existing in that period.
Exactly.
It's a single idea there. Because people would make the argument that, well, maybe this could happen by some sort of simple natural selection process. Maybe this is just adaptation. Isn't everything just tending towards being better and competing more? But instead, you see much less competition and much more what you're describing, collaboration with a very focused intent. I mean, it looks a little bit like a space program. The idea of having this concerted effort to take life in the ocean and then make it livable on land, which you said is a totally harsh environment. I mean, the continents at that time with no atmosphere being pummeled by dangerous deadly radiation. You said no water, nothing there. That was as hostile to life in the ocean as anything in so-called in space is to man right now. But you saw the intentional move to recolonize that, to restructure that. That's something where, again, it's a future state defining what happens in the past.
This idea of adaptation has ingrained in people a sort of a false conception of the way that evolution it develops. Because, again, it's not a passive adaptation to some random change in the environment. What you see is life actually assimilating the hydrological cycle. You take something that maybe before was simply a function of evaporation off the oceans, and now you're seeing that process is consciously assimilated and then focused. It's actually channeled into very specific types of processes. It's channeled through the biomass into very specific new types of species. Like you said, the creation of the plant matter actually allows for the creation of complex animal life. I mean, you don't have that without that without the sort of prerequisite densities. Now, if that's clear, then you have to say, well, in the same way that life is able to assimilate the hydrological cycle, then you see a clear parallel, you see an analog in that, in the way that humanity has increasingly begun to assimilate the hydrological cycle. And that's not something that's recent. You go back to the very end of recorded history. We have been channeling the so-called natural flows into various irrigation systems and so forth. And those are some of the oldest structures, human structures on the planet.
You're presenting the question of the universal anti-entropy.
Right.
That anti-entropy is the characteristic of the universe.
Exactly. It's not, and the idea of adaptation is a way to try to obscure that. Instead of saying that what you're creating, again, is you're creating the preconditions for the future state. The future state is not something that you necessarily, that in fact you don't know what it is. You can't define it before. What you know is the process is characterized by forcing existing conditions into a potential.
Which we were discussing the other day about the universal system. The system works from the top down, and the top is moving upward.
Right. Right.
It's a true anti-entropic system.
And you're familiar with that in the case of human creativity.
Exactly.
That we know that you don't have, again, nobody, hopefully, for most people, when you're speaking a sentence, it's not, each word does not create the word that comes afterwards.
It's not the word so much, but word, because words are actually a derivative.
Yeah, that's exactly.
What you're dealing with is the fact that the human mind introduces a factor of anti-entropy which does not exist otherwise. And the animal species don't have it. Only the human mind has that particular kind of anti-entropic potentiality.
I
Right.
mean, through the ability to work with ideas as opposed to the derivative ideas.
Which goes back to what we were doing at the beginning here, talking about the human creativity, that is anti-entropy, the rejection of entropy, the rejection of all this kind of crap we're getting now, is the essential precondition for the existence of the human species. The environmentalist of today is an enemy of the human species. And now in the case of the British or the old oligarchs, this process was a process of social control where you had two antithetical parties. And one was the ruling class, the oligarch, and the other were the cattle. And the oligarchs would kill off the cattle and prevent the cattle, human cattle, from developing because the human cattle develop is no longer controlled by the oligarch. If that's your system of your British system, that's the Obama system. Obama is the enemy of humanity because he's the enemy of the principle of humanity.
And rigorously defined. That the idea is to try to keep a fixed population, trying to keep a fixed set of rules for social operation. That's what an empire is.
Yeah, but look at the effect of this. Look at what we're getting right now. We're getting the destruction of civilization. In the United States, you have the whole series of destructions since the killing of Kennedy. We have a regressive tendency overall, with some spurts of still progress in nuclei, but then more and more aggressively the destruction of those little nooks and crannies which still represented creativity. We're now on the verge of willful human self-extinction, which is represented by the Queen of England and her slave, Obama, and by other people. And you see in the case of Asia, as in China and the Asian countries now, you see a resurgence of an attempt at growth. Because the same kind of thing, you try to do one thing, that's not enough. You have to invent something else, acquire something else, make it grow. You have to take a population from low level of productivity to a high level of productivity, which is what's happening in Asia. In Europe, you're seeing exactly the transatlantic region, exactly the opposite process. Now, this thing in Asia is not that promising, but it's an exception to the downward tendency. Which you're getting in the transatlantic region.
At least the flavor is right. You see total collapse on the European side.
And you see exactly what he's talking about in this context. We're seeing an anti-entropic universe, characteristically anti-entropic. Instead of trying to look at these things as causal in the small, that is interaction, you look at this as a process which is determining what we call interaction. Which is the theme you were doing with before.
Right.
In other words, if you look at the process as a universal process rather than a building block process of building blocks, building blocks,
Right.
which is what the ordinary explanation is, you see that the universe has a characteristic. And when we try to understand the galaxy, like a phenomenon like the we have now there, you see a completely contrary process is universal.
Right.
And the whole idea of trying to make this the adaptation, the natural selection, free trade, the idea of free trade or the markets. Anybody who says the markets are going to define economics, these are all meant to obscure exactly that. They're meant to try and make a different argument.
Yeah, well, I'm just pointing that with this thing, the case he presents, I think I interrupted here because it's so important to emphasize this. That there is a universal process. It's not a microcosm process. It's not an interaction process, a microcosms. It's an overall process which is a self-developing, a true anti-entropic process. And you look at the total energy flux density represented by the whole system.
Right.
From our record of the system, we find the anti-entropy is the dominant characteristic of the entire system.
Right.
And it's the fact that you aren't able to maintain the rate of anti-entropy means that your species is out of business.
Right. Yeah, it's a process that defines the species.
Right.
The species are bounded by the process.
Well, it's one that is that the progress of the process is the condition for the existing life of the species. Look,
Which is the irony of all these mass extinctions.
exactly. What killed them was the failure to develop.
And some of the biggest mass extinctions correspond to some of the biggest shifts in the whole system.
Yeah. So therefore, you get this complementarity. So what you're looking at is, I know Sky will deal with this later, What we're dealing with is the fact that this process itself is self-creative. And you try to explain this in kinematic terms, you end up with nonsense. It's the process as a whole. It's like, a society, for example, is a simple process. A society that's progressive. It's starting from elements, it's adding other elements, acquiring them, and you find progress. Then you have the other kind of society which goes to extinction. All empires go to a point of extinction. The British Empire is going to a point of extinction now. It's trying to save itself by eating the rest of the world. We have the United States as being self-destroyed. The United States has become a self-extinction phenomenon under these influences since the killing of Kennedy. It's been in that direction.
And what's nice is if you take a look at this overall arc, like what you're laying out, it does define some very clear policy directions. One thing I know you've gotten that you can lay out now is the actual role of the relationship of NWAPA to this overall process of development that you've just described. Because it's sort of amazing how clearly what we're talking about is advancing that same kind of it's approach.
If you take the process in human development, again, the refractions of that tend to have similar kinds of, they leave similar kinds of fossils. The number of actual chemical compounds that exist, known to exist, have increased geometrically, especially in the last few hundred years since the Industrial Revolution.
That's the difference between man and the animal.
Right.
We're different. We're a completely different kind of species than an animal.
Yeah, and it would be evident by this creature viewing the planet from above, and especially if you begin to see the way that take the hydrological cycle as, again, a sort of a baseline, is you entrain certain flows of that. I mean, NWAPA is really just it's the floor plan for where you have to go. I mean, it itself is, again, it's sort of 50 years overdue. But you take a quarter of the precipitation on the North American continent, a certain amount of that, which is running off, 20% of the runoff, you bring down, because you realize that just in the same way, for example, that life had to free itself from the caprices of the water cycle. I mean, look at the development of seeds. You're compacting a process. The fertilization, you're taking that which under the spore system but had to occur in open puddles of water, you're compacting that now into a protected seed which has a greater investment of nutrients and energy density, but it has a greater potential to spread itself and increase the overall process. We similarly have to free ourselves from the sort of embedded problems in the rainfall cycle. Certain places get rain, certain places don't. There's no reason that we should be constrained within a system defined by that kind of process. But again, it's a question of taking us to a point, really just a baseline point from which we're going to have to develop. NWAPA, again, is a seed crystal. As you take the continent as a whole, as you redirect the flows and create artificial rivers, and included in that is expanding the power available for industrial processes and other things. That's only a seed crystal for the spark for creating that same process around the planet. And it links very nicely across the Bering Strait into Siberia, links very nicely to the Aral Sea project, to projects in South America across the Darien Gap. So we have to similarly build into the system the crises, which are good. We build into our own process of development the crises that we know we have to overcome. With life, it successively runs into crises which are not conscious in that sense. They require a change in the system. And the change in the system always involves the wiping out of certain species and the creation of new ones. We deliberately drive our systems to points of crises, but we don't have to wipe ourselves out in the process. That's the difference.
Now, let's compare that to the argument of the environmentalists. The arguments that are leveled against NWAPA as a project are specifically that. You say the argument is, well, this is how the system is right now. You cannot change the way the system is right now. We're going to keep it here. We're going to, this species is endangered. We're going to hold on to it. These water basins are not connected. We will not allow them to connect. What the argument is saying, the argument is quite literally that we are going to attach ourselves as much as we can to one state of the system. We're going to consciously choose to hold ourselves to a specific state of the system. Now, we know that that system has to collapse at a certain point. The attempt to try and hold that system still drives it to a collapse point. Like you said with empire, the reason all empires collapse, the real corruption there is it's not as though the empire did something bad. It's not as though the empire was successful for a little while and then did something wrong. The attempt to try and hold that closed system there and to prevent human creativity, to prevent the actual evolutionary development, the attempt to do that will drive you to a collapse point.
We have two things. You have one thing to consideration, what is intention as what is a not different kind of process than we would normally think of intention. In all these cases, the intention of the universe, as we've just been discussing it, the intention of the universe is always to go to higher and higher states of organization. In other words, the universe is intrinsically anti-entropic. Now, what happens if you have a system which is not anti-entropic by exception, but the exception is entropy? Now, therefore, what happens if the system is anti-entropic and you're trying to impose an entropic condition upon an anti-entropic system? What happens? You got to kill. And what kills them is the anti-entropy.
Right.
So that's the process we're dealing with here.
And any closed system will be entropic.
Exactly.
Anything that's closed.
And therefore, this is the essential principle, which is what many famous people talked about in terms of.
Carnot's?
Well, not just thinking Carnot. I was thinking, particularly of our biblical figures, where the argument was that the
Philo of Alexandria.
Yeah, but more that the argument was that the process of creation of the universe, this is the old biblical system, the process of the universe was limited and it cut off at a certain point.
Right. Aristotelian argument.
Therefore, that causes the kills. And you look at the characteristic of societies. All societies of the type we could call imperialistic or proto-imperialistic have this characteristic. You have a society that moves in, like southern Mesopotamia, the Hittite area, so forth. They move in at a certain point and develop. Then they come in with they impose a barrier. And the barrier then results in a collapse of the system. Every system we know of human societal systems tend to go through these kinds of collapses. And the collapse is based on trying to keep the same old, same old, same old. And the minute you do that, you find the destruction of the system. The failure to progress, the failure to go to higher and higher levels of technology, expression of technology, is a killer. And take the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was already came into existence because other empires had been killed before. Other oligarchical systems had been killed by self-induced destruction. The Roman Empire was a case of self-destruction. The Byzantine Empire, which came up to replace it, was destroyed by self-destruction. The chivalry system was destroyed by self-destruction. And now we're getting into the British system, the British Empire, which is the fourth Roman Empire in effect, historically, which is now trying to absorb the United States to crush it, because the United States had been the greatest threat to the British Empire, or the Fourth Roman Empire. Now the Fourth Roman Empire has been crushing the United States. Now you find a coming back of China, a new development in Russia, developments in India, and so forth, which are going to try to fight against this process. What's happening? The British Empire, in the process of destroying itself, is determined to destroy China and India, and Russia, among other points. Russia is now on a regrowth pattern. It's not a very impressive one yet, but it's regrowth. China is major regrowth. It has a problem is coming up to a problem level. What we're talking about in terms of development of the Trans-Pacific system and so forth, what we're talking about now, we give them a way of continuing progress. If we continue progress, they will survive. They will progress. If they try to consolidate their position within a fixed framework, and then we allow the interest where you say some people in the system can cheat, they can eat up the other people in the system. Now what that does becomes a repression of the process, and then we go back into backwardness. It's happened in the United States repeatedly. And it's in the political system. The political system in which the United States was created has been destroyed by British influence repeatedly. It's now self-destroying in it. You look at the legacy of presidents. How many presidents of the United States were crumb bums? Just think of them. Just think of them. They were skunks, real skunks. And they always represented a British influence inside the United States, going through Wall Street and Boston and places like that initially, which were British havens. And they have always tried to destroy by getting a small group of people, a fixed group of people, to turn the others into what's happening with agriculture. We have an irrational system of control of seeds by monopolies. The seeds now prevent us from growing food. The whole system is now based on preventing a food crop. The international food crop is determined to try to control population, prevent population control. Monsanto is one of the worst victims of criminals in this operation. So what we have is the general failure of society to recognize that the European system was wrong, that the oligarchical system is wrong, the zero growth formula is wrong, the oligarchical system is wrong. That whenever mankind, as we have demonstrated in the United States development, and others have demonstrated that if you allow the human mind to be developed and to allow an anti-entropic tendency in society to work, society works. The human species works. If you try to stop that and have a fixed system, impose a fixed system on the human population, it becomes degenerative. And the thing is, right now, we are globally, especially in the transatlantic region, especially in the North Transatlantic region, we are in an area of self-destruction. And what we've had is our presidents, the last 3 presidencies, 2 Bushes and this guy. This has been a force of willful self-destruction of the United States. And you have the awesome spectacle of people who were decent citizens, so to speak, of actually adopting an idea which ensures their destruction. Could there be any worse insanity than that? But we have an incumbent president who is not only politically insane, but his policies are insane, which is probably why they selected him for president. And we have that pattern in the world at large. We have the willful zero growth, so-called zero growth policy, the willful destruction of the human species by the rulers of the human species. You have resistance from China, which is saying, no, we're going to grow again. China grew in the past, we're going to grow again. We're going to pick up everything that's around us good and do that. Russia's going through an attempt the same direction. There's an impulse like that in India. There are impulses elsewhere like that. Wherever there's an impulse like that, you find the British are organizing all the other clowns on the planet to gang up against nations which are actually trying to progress.
And the character of that progress, I think it's important, is actually defined by commitment to nuclear power. Because take the solar power policy. I mean, here's a good example of going the wrong way down a one-way street in terms of the rising requirements. Again, the baseline concept. The distinction between the action of chlorophyll, and particularly when it's now embedded in plant life, in what it's capable of doing with sunlight, taking this relatively low energy density, impinging sunlight, and transforming it, creating a higher potential through the contribution to the water cycle, through the creation of complex new sugars, carbohydrates, and so forth, and supporting the structure of this whole process, versus the actual process in a solar panel, which is actually degrading the energy largely into heat and a tiny whisper of electricity, which may have been sufficient for the dinosaurs, but when applied to the system now, if you take it to the logical extreme in its systemic characteristics, you would actually be destroying chlorophyll. You would be increasing the deserts. They want to cover the deserts with solar panels. You'd be lowering the overall net process of growth that's required by the system as a whole. And so the greenies, in pushing solar panels, are actually putting themselves toe-to-toe, opposing the actual growth of green plant life, which...
Right.
It's suicide by another name.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe the opposite of the process you just described about how life created the requirements for further spread inland.
Yeah.
They'd be creating the necessity for further desertification,
Right.
desert development. It's the exact opposite of what life did itself. It's the
Exactly.
ultimate. It's the anti-green policy in its essence.
Not to mention that it kills bugs, but
Yeah, right.
that's another...
Right.
As opposed to nuclear power plants where you can grow other plants on top.
That's
but
right.
It's not the most important part, but you can have a little garden on top of your nuclear power plant. No garden on top of your solar cells. Yeah, no, it's real clear that you've got and again, it's the texture. You can get to what is the texture of the ontological texture of physically developing time. And it's inherently paradoxical from any simple mathematical, even simple geometrical model. Because the idea of what is the paradox of a self-developing system? And again, you laid out in detail some key elements of this in a series of papers, but you had a very dense form of it in your Obama's Armageddon Endgame.
I got to finish one, which does the crucial thing on this.
Okay, it's going to be a solid arc. I mean, this is going to form a text that people need to study in detail, because there is a real paradox. What do you mean by self-development? I mean, very early on, Cusa in his On Learned Ignorance lays out the fundamental paradox of this. Well, how do you get, what does it mean to say, you get the simple fundamentalist religious idea of, well, God creates the universe. But if you really take the thought, well, how do you get if fundamentally these physical processes really are manifesting creativity, mind, in a way that reflects the creativity of the individual human being? Somehow the whole process does that. How?
Go further with that. Take the deductive ignorancia. Now, this has a number of significances, but it boils down to this. You had the worst of the collapses of the Roman Empire, which was turned in the Crusader period, the worst destruction imaginable. In the period from that, from the beginning, actually the beginning of the century, about the time of Cusa's birth, that he developed in the deductive ignorancia was actually, what he says is that essentially that the fixed system which we're living within, or assuming we're living within, this fixed system does not work. It's a failure. That's the meaning of deductive ignorancia. That is what we don't know yet, because we haven't created it yet. So the entire system of all modern European science was actually presented by Cusa in that work. That's what Kepler was. That's why the British hate Kepler, and people like that, hate Kepler, because Kepler posed this question. And you'll find in physical science that everyone who like Leibniz, was hated for this reason. And you have only a minority of great leaders in science who in various periods of opportunity actually developed science in a positive way and society in a positive way. A very limited number of people. Take the case of, for example, of Planck, Max Planck, and Einstein. Some of their work, which was developed at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, was held stagnant by people like Bertrand Russell and company, and these clowns. And we have come to the end of that. The destruction of civilization, of 20th century civilization, has been destroyed by the influence of people like swine, like Bertrand Russell. Now we come to a point where you have people who are on the outside, like in China, a new current in Russia, and so forth, are trying to move forward. And the British Empire, which is the empire of evil, and with its people like Obama, who's purely evil, insane man. I don't know how evil you can call him. He's clinically insane. And somebody decided to make a clinically insane man president of the United States. That was not exactly the brightest idea that was ever concocted. So that's the kind of situation that and that is the principle of the deductive ignorancia. is exactly that the science means the synthesis, not the proof of what is,
Yes.
but the synthesis of what must become.
Right, the opposite of deduction.
Exactly.
And people have a lot of trouble with that. They say, well, isn't everything either deduction or induction? But it's not. Creativity, the way Kuza defines it there, is a completely different process.
You got this thing with Vanansky. Vanansky has a similar kind of influence, and he has a seminal influence, as Kuza did, a similar kind of thing. Yeah? It goes to pure creativity.
Right.
That's his definition. He understands these phases of existence of life, non-life, life, and conscious life, consciously creative life, as being different qualities of existence. And that's the issue. Then you had the Communist Party of Russia, of the Soviet Union, killed itself by rejecting what was represented by him.
Right.
And that's so. This is the issue, the same issue you're describing in a different sense. It's the process of creativity, which is natural to the universe. The universe is natural. I mean, just you've got this anyway.
Right. I mean, quickly, I think we could go through what we've got. I mean, if you'd like, we've got some on hand right now. I mean, to get the sense of what some of the, again, if we look at some more of the qualitative changes through this period here, you can get an idea that there are, again, these metrics that are a shadow of this other process that let you see that this character of self-development, this character of what you call, the learned ignorance Akuza describes, has an ontological character. It's not just how you think as a person. It is how you think as a human being, but also it's he's describing there something that's ontological about the so-called objective physical universe.
Yeah.
I say so-called because we'll get to that distinction is not as hard and fast as people like to make.
I mean, building on what we did last week, I mean, one of the ironies in this that we've discussed is this irony of the extinctions themselves, because you have, we were just discussing that you have the system determining the species. It's beyond the species, not the kinetic interaction of the species that's determining the overall process. You have something else pulling the whole thing forward, like you discussed very well with the case of the feathers, the independent repeated attempts to bring in this new system. But then it's worth, just to make the point, I mean, that take one of the largest of these mass extinctions, the PT mass extinction. Not only was it one of the largest, to different estimates range of 96% of all species that existed in the Paleozoic era were wiped out at that time. But it also represented one of the largest upshifts just across the board, from life on land, life in the oceans, plant life, fungal life. You just had this rapid increase in the overall energetic activity of the biosphere. And this is a characteristic, again, we're going to do more to pull this out in more consolidated form. But underlying this entire process, species come, species go. But underlying the entire process has been this constant increase in the amount of total energy usage of the biosphere. More sunlight taken into higher, more complex forms, taken in, becoming denser and denser forms of energy. Total spread of total area of plant life, where it can actually take in more total sunlight. And the increase in you see it in the metabolic rates, you see it in the consumption, a constant increase in the energy requirements of each species. And you see the qualitative increases in, as we discussed, what the different species can do. But
in particular, you'd point out, if you look at the dominant species in each of these stages here, you get a shift.
Yeah, exactly.
You look at the change in the apex predator, and
Right.
then the whole system that's designed to support that so-called apex predator.
You see the whole Mesozoic we have here represented in the first system. You have this amphibian-dominated based system moving to the reptilian-based system. But the point is, as we're getting at, that there is a principle that underlies the succession of species. There's a principle that underlies the whole process, and that's what determines what species make it and which species don't. And you see it very clearly with, there's, like we've discussed, there's other examples of major extinction events, major shifts, but these two we've pulled out are very clear because you have two of the largest extinction events, mass extinction events, but they also express two of the largest total upshifts in the energy of the whole life system, of the whole biosphere. And it defines, and this is then what defines, so you just have this irony, the largest extinctions, well, what are they? They're the largest increase in the upshift of the whole life system. And so this, like we're discussing, this defines progress not as just a good thing. This defines progress as an absolute necessity for existence. I mean, this,
right, and rigorously definable. As you say, you look at the whole, I mean, all the elements that you see as you shift from the Paleozoic to the Mesozoic. I mean, if you treat it as now, continue the arc that you were describing, Ouyang, of this sort of motion onto land, this independence from the ocean, the degrees of independence you see clearly as you describe the whole system, including amphibians, ferns. You know, what do they have in common compared to you know, the Mesozoic system, including reptiles, seeding plants. There's a whole other level of encapsulation that's there.
Right.
Encapsulation, independence.
And it's very interesting. You see it paralleled in these totally different, seemingly different types of life. That, as you mentioned, with the fern-based life, the ferns require the nearby water and moist environment to reproduce because they release the spores and they need to intersect each other in the water to reproduce. The amphibian system, which also dominated during this same era, requires the water-based system to reproduce. You see this parallel characteristics over this first system that we've identified here. Then with the shift at the PT, you have not only the development of seeds with the gymnosperms. Again, they came in earlier, they began to develop, similar with the feathers case. Where they
maybe give people an idea of the gymnosperms too.
Yeah, you have the beginning of the, people are familiar with conifers, pine trees, but you have the beginning of a seed form of life, plant life, as Ouyang discussed. That becomes then the dominant form of plant life for this whole Mesozoic system. But then paralleled, you have this a similar, which allows the plants to move further inland. They're not tied to the water cycle to reproduce the same way the ferns were. Then you have the very similar, you have the same quality of shift with the animals as well, shifting to the reptilian-based system. The reptiles are no longer tied to the water systems to reproduce. They have these enclosed eggs that have the nutrients and liquids and whatnot needed to support the developing new organism. So they can move further inland. So you have this very stark paralleled development as a whole system moves to a higher state. And it gets totally destroys the whole kinetic conception.
Right.
That it's just the sequence of one random change to the next. When you have these entire plants changing, animals changing, fungal life changing, ocean photosynthetic life changing, all corresponding with these system shifts. I think we're going to have to do more to present the full details in more video report.
One key to that, what we've been saying in this hour and a half or so, essentially is that the past is created by the future. That's because the point, when you look at the way evolution is determined, the process of evolution is determined, it's always determined from the top down. The idea precedes the discovery. This is something which I'm going to deal with in other occasions much more rigorously. But that's the way it is. What creativity is, it comes from the organization of a system which organizes from the top down. The idea organizes the process. That's a crude way of putting it, but it does explain to us what the problem is, that the potential for development defines development. And this, the idea of a creator, a religious notion of a creator, is based on that you don't have individual little things crawling around. What you have is you have a massive process called the universe, and you have sub-universal processes, which are always located not in time as time is defined, but located in, well, Laplace would have a terrible time with it, but rather in the future is actually embedded within us. And it's the creativity of mankind which makes this a question of consciousness. We can be conscious of the future. Other forms of life, like animals, are not really conscious of the future. They're motivated somewhat in that direction, but they never actually create. They do innovate. express an innovation. You can, if you influence the animal, if you can train it, the animal will actually acquire behavioral characteristics which resemble human characteristics. But the animal has not got human characteristics. You, by association with the animal, have induced a human-like characteristic of future orientation, which no other species has. But the whole system itself, at the same time, is organized around future orientation.
Now, the irony, in order for that single animal to actually do something that might look creative, it actually has to die. In order to get the new creature, the new evolution, the old animal vanishes.
Or species, a type of species,
Yeah.
yes.
Right.
But the point is, since the system is a system, the system is disposed to self-improvement.
Yeah.
And so everything in the system is absorbed by this self-improvement. So instead of looking at progress as pushed, think of progress as pulled. And pushing is down, and pulling is up.
And then you get the real fraud of all of these monetarists who try to argue that, oh, well, you should not plan economies. You should allow the markets to handle it. You should allow free trade to handle things.
That's a swindle.
Yeah.
That's an absolute
It's a
lie
total-
that people believe in. It doesn't work. Look, I've been forecasting professionally, actually doing in performance in 1956 is when I did my first forecast. And I was unique, and I was the only one who made that forecast. And it hit exactly on the time I said it would. Ever since that time, all forecasts made by my so-called rivals have failed. And I've always succeeded. Now, admittedly, I've made only a few forecasts, about a couple dozen, that's all. But I only made them when I knew what I was doing, which meant that I did not always have the opportunity to know what I should be doing. But every forecast I've made has worked, exactly in the terms I did it. The problem is we get people who think in terms of a money profit driver, and they don't realize that money itself is a faker. The reason why forecasting fails is because people believe in money or believe in a monetary system. That's why they fail. Because actually wealth is developed not by money. Wealth is developed by productivity, by creativity, by the application and realization of creativity, whether postponed creativity or some other form of creativity. Wealth, in the sense we define wealth, we define wealth sometimes with animals, but we influence animals. Most of the animals of the planet exist only because man has maintained them as living forms. We raise cattle. We do all these kinds of things. We cause it. And so mankind has creativity, but what creativity is an apperception of the future potentiality, which means it takes the form of the discovery of principles. And you find the typical forecaster is intrinsically incompetent. I mean, I've been doing this for decades. And everyone I've been up against, until the opposite side, has always been wrong. So why do they stick to the system? Because they believe committed to something. But what does it mean they defeat? What does these bankruptcies mean? What does this collapse of civilization mean? It means the wrong policy of practice is going into effect. Things are getting worse, much worse. Since Jack Kennedy was killed, the actual trend in the U.S. economy physically has been down. It's been unevenly up and down, but it's been there. We have become worse and worse and worse in terms of our economic prospects since Jack Kennedy was killed, and especially since his brother was killed. Because if Bobby had lived, he would have been president. If he'd been president, he would have attempted to follow his brother's idea. We maintained some of what the Kennedy spirit was in the space program. He created it. He created other things, like NWAPA was actually a creation of his. So we had these programs which represented forward movement of civilization, especially in the United States. These were effectively killed by what? By long wars. 10 years in Indochina, long wars. Russia got a long war, a few long wars. Others got long wars. We're getting long wars again, long wars in the Middle East. They're headed for a real killer warfare, global thermonuclear warfare, which is on our table right now. So we can learn something from this if we just look at this way, that the universe is characterized by creativity. Creativity comes first. The universe is always going higher and higher energy flux density. That's its direction. That occurs as creativity. But we are moved by creativity. Plants, everything is moved by creativity of some sort of manifestation of creativity. Mankind's willful creativity is crucial for civilization. And that's what's being suppressed now. And the other side of this is fear. It's fear of the opposition that does not want creativity. Why does the Democratic Party given up on trying to get rid of this bum, this Obama? They've given up on this thing. If the Democratic Party carries out its policy in the next months, the policy it has recently adopted for purposes of the election campaign, the United States is finished. If the Democratic Party policy right now is carried forward, the United States will be finished this year. And those who are controlling the Democratic Party, who are leading it, even people who I know who are intrinsically would be good people, are making that mistake out of fear because they're afraid of taking on the British and taking on Obama. So and you have the Republican Party, the leadership there, Mitt Romney, was a disaster for the United States. An absolute disaster, unbelievable. He's a real monster. He's not as insane as Obama is. He's just evil. But you don't have to be insane to be evil. But that's the case in this case. And the problem is we lack an insight into the intention which ought to be associated with the nature of humanity. And we see it in terms of this study, which what we're doing here today is merely touching the surface on this whole question. But this is the decision, this is where our decision is what every American citizen out there really is confronted by that decision, whether they wish to make it or not. If they don't get rid of Obama, the intention of the British Empire, which has a puppet called Obama, is to, since the British system is now on the verge of extinction, as in many kinds of Roman empires before this, and similar kinds of empires before, have gone into an extinction mode because they would not adjust to reality. That's what happened to the first Roman Empire. The first Roman Empire collapsed, degenerated. So then they've got a new Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, degenerated. And you've got the Venetian system, called the Crusader system, degenerated. And then we had another renewal of that with various attempts at a new empire, which ended up with the British Empire, which is formed by the new Venetian party of William of Orange, who had already came from the new Venetian party from earlier. So that's the kind of system. We have a situation in which people are induced to behave like animals, that is to go away from creativity, to go to conservatism, that is not to be creative. And we're in a situation now where the entire Western Hemisphere, the transatlantic region, especially the northern part, is now going to an extinction mode. Europe is an extinction mode. The United States is in an extinction mode. And as long as you have Mitt Romney coming up and Obama behind us or whatever, we're in an extinction mode. And the question is, how many people in the United States have both the brains and the guts to change it? And there's still time for some attention, some of the science of this matter. Because what most people believe out there today from schools and so forth, they're absolute idiots. They have no conception whatsoever of their education tends to be a de-education. And this is a crisis for all humanity right now. And it's an immediate crisis. Every week ahead is ominous. And we're on the verge of a global thermonuclear conflict. And the submarines of the United States in the Pacific Ocean have enough thermonuclear capability to be used, which would mean a mass extinction on the planet if that and other nations got into a rivalry on thermonuclear exchanges. And we are right now under Obama and under the control of the British monarchy, we are headed for a human extinction phenomenon called thermonuclear war. And it can happen anytime. Some of us have delayed that war from happening. Some of our chiefs of staff and so forth have contributed to delaying that process. But the process has not been taken away. And the Democratic parties collapse to submit to and support Obama is an act of willful mass suicide, not only of the party, but most Americans. And if they don't change their habits, they're going to find out how dumb they've been.
I think that's a good solid point to end with. Can move. But yeah, again, we're going to have a lot more of this, sharpening this, but the need right now to evade extinction, I think, is absolutely clear. The steps we're going to be making clear.
Well, which you're already on the course on this thing, right? The point is, we know how to deal with this from a standpoint of policy. And if we change this policy, we can solve the problem. The capability still exists. We've got to stop this war from happening. We've got to get rid of Obama out of office. He's clinically insane, and he can be thrown out of office for being clinically insane. And he is clinically insane. There's no doubt of it. And if we do that, now you have the British control over Europe is breaking up. Huh? Because what happened is that some of us had the guts. And I made my effort in that direction as well. Had the guts to cause the postponement of what was intended to be the outbreak of the countdown into thermonuclear war, which was supposed to occur right after the killing of Gaddafi. So various forces, including people in our own country, caused a delay of that process. As a result of that delay, the European system, which is going to be gobbled up axiomatically by the British Empire through the Euro operation, the Euro operation is now disintegrating. And my friend Jacques Cheminad's relative success in his appearance as a presidential candidate for France typifies that. There's a breakup in process. The French and the Germans are no longer allied for the euro. They can't be allied for the euro. The euro system is hopelessly bankrupt. The U.S. economy is hopelessly bankrupt financially now. Without the combination of Glass-Steagall and the reform in our monetary system, we're out of business soon. And all these idiots are out there contending, like this crazy Mitt Romney, a greedy bastard, who wants all kinds of greed satisfaction, but he has nothing useful for the human race. Obama's worse than that. And so you've got a Republican Party, you've got a Democratic Party, you've got an election year, and there's no competence shown by the leadership of the Democratic Party, no competence shown by the leadership of the Republican Party. Woe to the United States unless we do something about this. And so those Democrats in particular, I don't think you could get a good Democratic vote or a good Republican vote. I think there are good Republicans out there who might become candidates or are, and the Democrats as well. Probably, I don't know how it would come out that way. But we could, theoretically, we could compose a presidency. Just put this garbage aside. Obama, garbage. We don't want any renewal of that. Mitt Romney, garbage. We don't want him either. He's just almost as bad. He's homegrown as opposed to a foreign import. But if we don't do that, this nation is not going to survive. And we have to do it this year. And I have Democratic friends, for example, who foolishly have decided to back off from opposing Obama on the basis of partisan considerations. They're making it a fatal mistake, a potentially fatal mistake. It would kill many of them, because I know what's sitting out there. If Obama were president, I know what Hitler did in Germany would be, at the first, relatively mild compared to what Obama would do. And any American who's voted for Obama must be one of the most stupid or most frightened people on the planet, or cowardly on the planet. But that's have to happen. Right now, continue in this direction, Democratic Party in this direction, Republican Party in this direction, this nation is finished. Civilization is finished, unless a change comes. They ain't so smart as they think they are.
All right. Well, a lot to think about and a lot to act on. That'll wrap up this week's show. We'll see you next week. Thank you.